Between the years 1948 and 1972, a quiet evacuation hollowed out the ancient quarters of the Middle East. 856,000 people vanished from cities they had built before the arrival of Islam. Their synagogues became police stations. Their cemeteries were paved over to build highway cloverleafs. Their homes were confiscated under laws written in the middle of the night. Today, fewer than 4,000 remain. This is not the story of a voluntary migration. It is the story of a multi-billion-dollar asset seizure engineered by a network of governments that used an unresolved war to cover up the systemic destruction of their own middle classes. Most history books blame the birth of Israel for this sudden collapse. They are wrong. The files hidden in the colonial archives of London and the declassified cables of the foreign ministries in Paris tell a completely different story. The real driver was not religious hatred. It was a massive, undeclared economic bankruptcy that forced three collapsing empires to look for liquid capital in the bank accounts of their most vulnerable citizens. One minor bureaucrat in Baghdad signed a single decree that transferred more wealth in 48 hours than the entire oil industry produced in that decade. We will come back to him. By the end of this narrative, you will know exactly how three sovereign nations ran a coordinated currency freeze, how the international community looked away because of a secret regional pipeline deal, and why the true financial records of this exodus remain under lock and key in a basement in Geneva. The narrative does not begin in the desert. It begins in the marble halls of the Grand Serail in Beirut during the hottest summer of 1947. The French mandate was crumbling. The British were packing their trunks in Jerusalem. A generation of nationalist politicians had just inherited state budgets that were entirely empty. In Iraq, the royal government was spending 60% of its total national revenue just to suppress tribal rebellions in the north. The oil royalties from the Iraq Petroleum Company were locked in British pounds sterling, which London had frozen to protect its own collapsing currency after the war. Baghdad was wealthy on paper, but its treasury could not pay the salaries of its own police force. Enter Nouri al-Said. He was a man who had survived 14 assassination attempts by knowing exactly when to pivot. He looked at the census data. The Jewish community of Baghdad did not just live in the city. They were the city. They controlled 75% of the import-export licenses. They ran the Chamber of Commerce. The administrative backbone of the Iraqi Ministry of Finance was entirely staffed by men who wrote their ledger entries in a specific dialect of Judeo-Arabic. If you wanted to buy grain from the south or sell textiles to the north, you had to pass through a merchant house in the old quarter of Al-Tarat. To the nationalist officers in the army, this community was a foreign body. To Nouri al-Said, they were a liquid reserve. He realized that if he could provoke a crisis, he could solve the state debt without firing a single shot at a British oil tanker. Read that number again. 856,000. You do not lose that many people by accident. The machine was already moving. In the autumn of 1947, the United Nations was preparing to vote on the partition of Palestine. The streets of Cairo and Damascus were filling with organized mobs. But the archives show that these mobs were not spontaneous. The declassified dispatches from the British Embassy in Cairo confirmed that the Egyptian Ministry of the Interior was actively supplying transport buses and banners to the rioters. The goal was simple: create an atmosphere of total terror so that the emergency laws could be passed without parliamentary opposition. On the 16th of May, 1948, Egypt declared martial law. Royal Decree number 126 was signed that evening. It did not mention religion. It mentioned national security. It gave the military governor the absolute power to seize any property belonging to any person whose activities were deemed prejudicial to the safety of the state. Within 48 hours, the banks in Alexandria received a confidential list of 700 firms. Their assets were frozen. Their managers were arrested. Their warehouses were sealed by the customs police. The government told the public that this was a measure to prevent funds from reaching the Zionist enemy. But the internal receipts of the Egyptian treasury tell a different story. The seized funds were transferred directly into the general state account to fund the purchase of surplus British military equipment. The economic purge had begun. While Cairo was draining the bank accounts of its elite merchants, Damascus was taking a more direct route. The Syrian state was practically bankrupt after the departure of the French. The new president, Shukri al-Quwatli, faced an army mutiny over unpaid rations. In February 1948, the Syrian government passed Law No. 108. It banned all Jewish merchants from obtaining import licenses or executing foreign exchange transactions. If you cannot trade, you cannot survive in a merchant city like Aleppo. The great trading families of the Silk Road families that had lived in the shadow of the citadel since the time of the Seleucids found themselves with warehouses full of goods they were legally forbidden to sell. The state then offered them a choice. They could sell their properties to government-approved buyers for 10% of their market value, or face trial before a military tribunal for economic treason. Most chose to flee across the Turkish border, leaving behind estates that had been held for generations. The Syrian treasury collected the difference. This system worked until a single decision in Baghdad unraveled 300 years of infrastructure in under a decade. Nouri al-Said watched the Syrian experiment and decided it was too slow. He needed a comprehensive solution that would liquidate the entire asset base of his country's largest minority in a single stroke. If you have never seen this story told this way, subscribe. More investigations like this every week. In March 1950, the Iraqi parliament met in a secret night session to pass Law No. 1. It was called the Denationalization Act. It allowed any Iraqi Jew to leave the country permanently on one condition. They had to renounce their citizenship forever. The law was supposed to be a safety valve to let a few thousand radicals leave. The government expected maybe 5,000 people to take the offer. They miscalculated completely. A series of small explosions targeting Jewish institutions in Baghdad created a wave of absolute panic. Historians still argue about who threw those bombs. Some blame Zionist underground agents trying to force emigration. Others blame the Iraqi nationalist group Istiqlal. The result was the same. Within weeks, 80,000 people had registered to leave. They lined up outside the synagogues turned registration centers holding small suitcases. They thought they were leaving with their lives and their property. They did not know that Nouri al-Said had already written the second half of the law. On the 10th of March 1951, while 50,000 registered emigrants were still waiting for planes at Baghdad airport, the parliament passed Law No. 12. It froze all assets of every citizen who had registered to leave under the previous law. They were trapped. They could not stay because they were no longer citizens. They could not take their wealth because the banks were locked by the police. Picture this scene at the airport. Families were forced to stand in long lines while customs officers stripped them of everything they owned. The regulations were precise. Each adult was allowed to leave with a maximum of 50 Iraqi dinars. No gold was permitted. No jewelry could leave the country except for one wedding ring per woman. The diaries of the emigrants describe officers using pliers to rip silver buttons off coats and searching children's toys for hidden coins. The total value of the property abandoned in Baghdad alone was estimated by British diplomats at more than £80 million sterling in 1951 currency. That is equivalent to over $2 billion today. The Iraqi state used these assets to establish the Directorate for the Care of Seized Property. This agency did not care for property. It auctioned off entire neighborhoods. The contents of grand villas in the Al-Alwiya district, carpets, grand pianos, library collections, silver services were sold to state officials for pennies. The real estate was handed over to government supporters or used to build state ministries. The ancient community of Babylon, which had survived the conquests of Cyrus the Great and the armies of Alexander, was liquidated in exactly 12 months. The economic story explains the surface. The geopolitical story explains why nobody stopped it. Remember the figure from earlier, 856,000 people. A migration of that scale requires international transport logistics. It requires airplanes, ships, food, medicine, and camps. Who funded the infrastructure that allowed these governments to empty their cities? The official narrative says that international Jewish charities paid for the airlift operations like Operation Magic Carpet from Yemen and Operation Ezra and Nehemiah from Iraq. This is true for the transport costs. But the files of the Foreign Office in London show that the British government was actively coordinating the schedules with the Iraqi monarchy. Why would Great Britain assist in the destruction of an economic class that had been its most loyal ally during the Mandate? The answer lies in the secret Anglo-Iraqi oil treaty negotiations of 1952. Baghdad was threatening to nationalize the Kirkuk oil fields, just as Mohammad Mossadegh had nationalized the oil fields of Iran. Nouri al-Said told the British ambassador that if he did not get an immediate concession on oil royalties, he would not be able to control the anti-Western mobs in the streets. He offered a deal. He would ensure that the British oil concessions remained safe if London remained silent about the confiscation of Jewish property. The British chose the oil. The archives contain memos where officials note that the migration was an internal Iraqi matter that should not interfere with the strategic stability of the region. Parallel to this in the shadows, another machine was running. The North African exoduses from Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia are usually described as a natural consequence of decolonization. When the French left, the Jews left with them. But the statistics show a much darker mechanism. In Morocco, the Jewish community numbered 250,000 in 1948. They were not modern immigrants. They had lived in the Atlas Mountains since the destruction of the Second Temple, and in the coastal cities since the Spanish expulsion of 1492. The Sultan Muhammad V had protected them during the Second World War, refusing to implement the Vichy race laws. But when Morocco achieved independence in 1956, the new nationalist government faced an immediate economic crisis. The French capital was fleeing the country. The Moroccan franc was plunging. The state needed a way to halt the drain of hard currency. The solution was the introduction of a complete ban on emigration and foreign currency transfers. The Jewish quarter, known as the Mellah, found itself under virtual economic blockade. You could not sell your house because no one would buy a property that the state might confiscate. You could not move your money out of the country because the postal banks were checked by the security service. This created a massive underground market run by an organization called the Miskaret. This was a secret branch of the Israeli intelligence service operating inside Morocco. They ran small boats from the beaches of Tangier and Casablanca to Gibraltar. They smuggled thousands of people out through the Spanish enclaves of Ceuta and Melilla. But this operation was not free. The declassified operational logs show that the Moroccan authorities were often aware of the escape routes. Why did they not close them? Because the Secret Service was receiving a quiet payment for every person who left. An agreement was reached where an international charity paid a specific amount of dollars per head to the Moroccan government for every emigrant allowed to board the ships. The state allowed its population to be drained because each departure generated fresh foreign currency reserves for the central bank. The people were treated as a commodity. They were traded for dollars that funded the initial budgets of the independent Moroccan kingdom. The human cost was buried under the language of diplomatic agreements. Most historians stop the story here. They should not. The ultimate fate of these 856,000 people is where the modern narrative becomes completely fractured. When they arrived in Israel, they did not find a land of milk and honey. They found the Mabarot. These were transit camps made of tents and corrugated iron sheets built on the edges of the desert and near the borders. The European elite that ran the early Israeli state looked at these immigrants from Arab lands with deep cultural suspicion. The established bureaucracy referred to them as Mizrahim, meaning the Easterners. They were subjected to systemic discrimination. Their names were changed. Their traditional clothing was confiscated and sprayed with DDT disinfectant. The elite merchants of Baghdad and the skilled jewelers of Sana'a found themselves working as manual laborers digging drainage ditches in the Galilee or picking oranges in the coastal plains. Their wealth was gone. The compensation claims they submitted to the Israeli Ministry of Justice were filed away in boxes that remain classified to this day. Why? Because the Israeli government realized that if they pushed for the return of Jewish property in Baghdad and Cairo, they would have to address the property claims of the 700,000 Palestinian refugees who had been expelled from their homes during the 1948 war. The two tragedies became locked in a cynical geopolitical balance sheet. The assets of the Arab Jews were used by Israel as an unofficial offset against the claims of the Palestinian refugees. The individuals themselves were never compensated. Their losses were treated as a historical transaction that settled itself through the exchange of populations. The records sit in an archive building in Jerusalem. Millions of pages detailing every house, every shop, every bank account, and every piece of gold left behind in the communities of the Middle East. That explains the network. But it raises a darker question. Who was funding it, and why did three governments pretend not to notice? The answer lies in the archives of the League of Nations and its successor, the United Nations. In 1951, the United Nations Conciliation Commission for Palestine estimated that the total value of Palestinian property lost in what became Israel was around £100 million. At the same time, the World Organization of Jews from Arab countries estimated that the Jewish property lost in Arab lands was more than £300 million. The numbers did not match. The wealth stolen from the Jewish minority was 3 times higher than the wealth lost by the Palestinian population. The international community realized that if they opened this ledger, they would reveal an economic crime of such scale that it would destabilize every post-war treaty in the Mediterranean. The previous figures were butchers. The next man was an architect of something far worse. His name was Abdel Latif al-Baghdadi. In 1961, he was the Minister of Economic Affairs for Egypt under Gamal Abdel Nasser. The country had just suffered a catastrophic economic blow. The union with Syria had collapsed. The cotton crop had been destroyed by pests. The foreign exchange reserves were down to less than $10 million. Nasser needed a massive injection of capital to fund the construction of the Aswan High Dam. The Soviet Union was providing engineering, but they were demanding payment in hard currency or agricultural exports. Baghdadi looked at the remaining foreign communities in Cairo and Alexandria. The British and French nationals had already been expelled after the Suez Crisis of 1956. The only remaining group with significant liquid assets was the Egyptian Jewish community, which had survived the initial 1948 confiscations through its deep ties to the local textile manufacturing sector. Baghdadi drafted the July Decrees of 1961. It was a complete nationalization of the private sector. The law did not explicitly target Jews, but its application was surgical. Every company with an annual turnover of more than 10,000 Egyptian pounds was taken over by the state. The owners were given government bonds that matured in 30 years, bonds that became completely worthless within 48 hours due to inflation. The families who had built the modern department stores of Cairo, stores like Sicurel and Chemla, were turned out onto the street. Their bank accounts were limited to a maximum withdrawal of 20 Egyptian pounds per week. The state security service, known as the Mukhabarat, began a campaign of midnight arrests. They would knock on doors at 2 in the morning, give the family 1 hour to pack 1 suitcase per person, and escort them directly to the port of Alexandria. The ships were waiting. They were French and Italian passenger liners chartered by the state. The captains were given orders to collect the passports of the passengers once the ships entered international waters. When they landed in Marseille or Genoa, they were stateless. Their identity documents were stamped with a single phrase in Arabic: "Good for one journey only. No return permitted." The economic story explains the surface. The geopolitical story explains why nobody stopped it. While this wealth was being drained, where was the international financial community? The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were actively reviewing Egypt's applications for loans during this exact period. The archives of the World Bank show that the staff analysts were fully aware of the nationalizations. In their internal reports, they did not classify the seizures as human rights violations. They classified them as necessary structural adjustments required to transition Egypt into a modern state-directed economy. The financial destruction of 80,000 human beings was treated as a bookkeeping entry that improved the state's creditworthiness. The international community did not care about the origin of the capital. as long as the state could pay the interest on its development loans. The same pattern repeated itself in Libya. In 1967, during the Six-Day War, the ancient community of Tripoli, which had lived there since the time of the Roman Empire, was attacked by mobs. The government of King Idris did not try to stop the rioters. Instead, they ordered the police to collect all 19,000 Jews in the country and place them in a military camp called Gargaresh. They told them it was for their own protection. Inside the camp, the families were forced to sign forms relinquishing their property rights in exchange for exit visas. They were allowed to leave with one suitcase and the equivalent of $20. The rest of their property, including the massive commercial blocks along the Corso Sicilia, was taken over by the state. 2 years later, when Muammar Gaddafi overthrew the king, one of his first acts was to pass Law No. 14 of 1970. It canceled all compensation agreements signed by the previous government. It declared that all property owned by Jews was now the permanent property of the Libyan people. The law went a step further. It ordered that all debts owed by Libyan citizens to Jewish merchants were legally canceled. The state did not just steal the assets, it erased the liabilities. The memory of the community was systematically wiped out. The old cemetery of Tripoli was dug up, and the tombstones were used to build the foundations of a seafront promenade. The system worked until the money ran out. By the middle of the 1970s, the process was complete. The cities of the Arab world had been hollowed out. The great cosmopolitan centers of the Mediterranean, centers that had been defined by their multilingual merchant elites, were turned into monolithic states run by military bureaucracies. The loss was not just financial, it was cultural. The music, the literature, the journalism, and the economic dynamism of places like Baghdad and Cairo withered away under the weight of state controls. The wealth that had been seized did not create prosperity. It was consumed by corruption, by inefficient state industries, and by endless military campaigns that resulted in nothing but defeat. The billions of dollars taken from the 856,000 individuals disappeared into the black hole of state deficits. The modern connection to this story is precise and material. Today, if you visit the city of Baghdad, you can still find the old Jewish quarter of Al-Tawrat. It is a maze of narrow alleys, crumbling brick arches, and locked doorways. The houses are legally owned by people who live in London, New York, or Tel Aviv. But their titles are frozen under the Iraqi law of seized assets. No one can buy them legally. No one can repair them. They are rotting away in the humidity of the Tigris. At the same time, the Arab states continue to demand the return of their national archives. Archives like the Iraqi Jewish Archive, which was discovered by American soldiers in the flooded basement of the Mukhabarat headquarters in Baghdad in 2003. The archive contains the Torah scrolls, the school certificates, the commercial ledgers, and the personal letters of a destroyed civilization. The current Iraqi government claims this material is part of their national heritage. They want it back. The individuals whose lives are documented in those papers argue that you cannot steal a library, murder its readers, and then claim the books as your heritage. The narrative ends where it began, in the archives. The true financial ledger of this exodus remains unsettled. It sits as a phantom asset on the balance sheets of multiple nations, an unresolved historic debt that no one intends to pay. The 856,000 individuals who vanished from the Middle East did not leave because of a change in the political weather. They were systematically mined for their capital by states that were dying of their own internal corruption. Their empty houses still stand in the centers of Cairo, Damascus, and Tripoli, silent witnesses to the largest undeclared asset transfer in the history of the modern Mediterranean. Tell us in the comments which part of this story they never taught in school. The documents are still sitting in the boxes at the National Archives in Kew under reference FO371. The names are still there. The numbers are still there. The ink is dry. Period.